Right, Miss Graham, when you're ready.
So sorry. PC Smith. I'd like to go back to the evidence video timeline and just show you 1 minute of that. It incorporates part of the Snapchat footage. And we're going to play from 7:21:28 or thereabouts to 7:22:29. And if you have the spreadsheet in front of you, you'll see that 7:21:28 is the time at which your van arrives. So it's really from the minute your van arrives at Hayfield Road, and then it's for a full minute after that. And as part of that footage, you should see the Snapchat footage that we've also looked at. So here we are, 7:21:28, and if we could play that for a minute, please, or just over a minute.
Control Bravo, one officer's been punched in the back of the head, no obvious serious injuries, male secure on the ground. 30 seconds out, 4-1.
It's Marshall. If you're alive, go ahead and give me an update, please.
Papa, what's the warning? I'll just approach, I'll give you an update. Update, Bill! And just some struggle!
Thank you. Were you able to see the CCTV initially and then the Snapchat
Yes.
comes on? Could you actually see yourself joining the people on the ground in the CCTV footage?
It's not
Coming
very
round.
well.
Not very well. And then looking at the Snapchat footage,
Yeah.
and perhaps we could get that back on the screen. So just rewind if possible slightly. All right. You'll see this enhanced Snapchat footage was extracted from the footage that we've just watched. Can we have the right hand tile on the screen, please? You'll maybe need to rewind slightly.
Update, Bill! And just some struggle!
We'll just take a moment here to get it back onto the screen. All right, well, we'll move.
Control for...
So it was 7:21
Control for...
to 22. If you want to play from there, that's fine. If you play from there, that's fine, and we can pause it when we reach the
Control
Snapchat.
Bravo, one officer's been punched in the back of the head, no obvious serious injuries, male secure on the ground.
Then can we pause it? Do you see the movement of someone running towards
Yeah.
the area of the restraint?
Yes.
Would that be you?
It would have to be.
Yeah. And then we'll play again and we'll see that person coming round to the front of where the officers are on the ground. So carry on.
30 seconds out, 4-1.
Do you see that person just coming round to the...
Yeah.
He's now got his back to us as we look at the
Yeah.
footage. And that was you.
Yeah.
It's Marshall. If you're alive, go ahead and give me an update, please.
And then does it appear that other officers appear to be moving around in that area?
Yes, it does.
I'll give you an update.
And then pause that, please. So now we see the enhanced Snapchat footage. Well, this is the Snapchat footage. It's not the separate footage that I've shown you earlier before lunch. And I think you said you were on the left-hand side?
Yeah.
Far left? And that was at the head area near the hands.
Yeah.
And the person with their back to us, to your right, I think you said that was PC Payton.
Yes, I think so.
And where was PC Walker?
He should be next to PC Payne. I can't really make him out, but that's real.
Could it be that PC Walker's lying there and part of his clothing can be seen?
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
That would be the general area he was in.
Is that the general area?
Yeah.
And then the person standing, I think before lunch you said was PC Gibson.
With his back to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he's joined by
Yeah.
this stage. And then the person opposite where you pointed out PC Payton,
Yeah.
facing the person with the camera with the dark hair, who was that?
PC McDonough.
So Gibson and McDonough have joined by
Yes.
this stage. And then the person facing, crouched down on the other side of the person, on the people on the ground, you said was PC Tomlinson?
Yes, it would have to be.
So that's who we can see there at that stage.
Yes.
At this moment in time, were the handcuffs on?
They were either on or very, very close to being on.
So by the time Gibson and McDonough have arrived, were the handcuffs on or just about to be on?
I don't know.
And then after the handcuffs go on,
Yes.
where did you move to?
Down towards his legs.
So at the moment we can see PC Gibson down towards his legs.
Yeah.
And that's the area that you then moved to
Yes.
after the handcuffs were on,
Yeah.
to assist with putting on the fast straps.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at Perk 278? This is your Perk statement, page 8, please. And the first 3 paragraphs. And you see, I moved down to the male's lower body, legs. That's when I became aware PC McDonough was there. He had his leg restraints in his hands. I think he was standing up at that point. PC Tomlinson was attempting to control the legs. He was lying across the male's legs. The male's legs were lying in the prone position, flat to the ground, knees to the ground by this time. I wasn't aware of any other officer being present at that point. So at the point that PC Tomlinson is attempting to control the male's legs, his legs were lying in the prone position, flat to the ground, knees to the ground by this time. Is that when PC Tomlinson is over his legs?
Yeah, I would think so.
Do you remember this being part of your Perk statement?
No, I can't remember.
But your memory was fresher when you gave
Yes,
this.
it was.
And then I attempted to get the male's legs straightened out to apply the fast straps. In the confusion, I took hold of PC Tomlinson's boot and started to pull his leg to straighten it out. I immediately realised it was not the male and let his boot go. I then took a hold of the subject's ankles and pulled his legs towards me to straighten the legs and get them together. All the while the subject resisted this and tried to curl his legs up and move them to prevent me straightening them. I succeeded in keeping both his ankles together and turning his feet sideways so they were facing down towards Henry Road, preventing him from bending his legs at the knees and getting more control. Do you remember saying that, Per?
I don't remember saying it,
But that would have
that
been
would
right.
have been, yeah.
And do you remember now, looking at that paragraph, that you grabbed or took a hold of PC Tomlinson's boot?
It rings a bell. I can't remember it specifically, but
Okay. Right. But you said that ultimately you succeeded in keeping his ankles together and you turned his feet so they were facing down towards Henry Road. And is that the area near the roundabout?
yes.
Thank you. And in doing so, you prevented him, the male, from bending his legs at the knees?
Yes.
Thank you. And then can I look at the 3rd paragraph, please? Myself and PC McDonough then succeeded in applying fast straps round the ankles. Subject was still attempting to move his legs about, causing my arms to be trapped underneath his feet, causing cuts to my fingers on my right hand, and you then got examined. So it appears from this paragraph that it was you and PC McDonough that applied the fast straps around the ankles. Do you remember that?
Again, not exactly, but if that's what I remembered it when I gave that statement, that'll be correct.
Your memory was fresher
Yeah.
then. Thank you. Can I ask you to look at SOP?
Yep.
PS 10933, use of force SOP, paragraph 20.5. Thank you. And this says, ideally the leg restraints need at least 2 police officers or staff working together to correctly apply them. The subject should be handcuffed to the rear and placed in the prone or lying face down position before the leg restraints are applied. Do you know of that SOP? You recognise that?
Not specifically. I'm aware there's an SOP that covers these matters.
Right. As I understand the position, the man was not handcuffed to the rear. He was handcuffed to the front.
That's
palm
correct.
to palm. Is that right?
Yes.
That's your recollection as well?
Yes.
Thank you. So this SOP in that paragraph of the SOP wasn't strictly adhered to in the sense he wasn't handcuffed to the rear. But am I correct in understanding that there was a lot of movement at the time?
Yes, it was driven by the circumstances we were facing. It seemed absolutely appropriate to then move on and apply the fast straps at that point.
Thank you. But once the handcuffs and the fast straps were applied, effectively the male on the ground was under control.
Yes.
So I'd like to move on to that moment when he was under control, and I'd like to look at PERC 278, please, page 8. And I'm interested in paragraph 8, which is the final paragraph on that page. And I'll just read this out. Once the restraints were applied, I stood up. And I think that's, you told us earlier you moved and
Yes.
stood up. And checked the injuries to my hand and was satisfied that they were superficial. I had a look at the male from where I was standing. He was tilted over to his front. I'm not sure that he was completely prone. Could you tell us what you meant by that? I'm not sure he was completely prone.
I can't recall exactly what I saw, but I would interpret that to be he was lying mostly on his front, but slightly over to his side.
Right, okay. PC Walker said that we would have to get the male onto his side, and I think PC Payton, Tomlinson and Walker moved him onto his side. I didn't hear the male say anything throughout this, but he was moaning. I would say that from arriving in Hayfield Road, speaking to PC Short, to the point that the male was effectively under control in handcuffs and fast straps, that a period of 3 to 4 minutes had elapsed. It was not a long period of time. And so this is the point at which handcuffs are applied, leg restraints are in place, you've stood up and started to move away, and PC Walker says you'll have to get the male onto his side. Now, I understand that he was moved onto his left-hand side. Is that your recollection? Yes. And you didn't ever hear him say anything, but you did hear him moaning.
Yes.
And when you say throughout this he was moaning, do you mean during the restraint he was moaning, or at any later time?
I think during the restraint.
During
I'm
the
difficult recalling exactly what noises he was making now, but I believe that means during the restraint.
When he was turned onto his left-hand side,
Yeah.
do you remember him saying anything or making any noises?
I don't recall.
Okay. When did you notice that the male had stopped struggling?
I'm not sure. I'm aware that the level of resistance was much lower, but other officers still had good control of him. So it wasn't really easy for me to see, not having any sort of physical contact, whether there was any struggling happening or not. But there was certainly no obvious resistance at that point, or very shortly after he was turned on his side.
So matters had changed from, you've talked about struggling and movement
Yeah.
prior to that, but you say there's no obvious resistance at that point.
Not to me from where I was, no.
You've stood up and
Yeah,
moved away.
moved away, and
Yeah.
to a small degree, turned my attention elsewhere as well.
Right. How long did it take you to turn your attention elsewhere and move away?
I'm not sure, maybe 30 seconds to a minute. But again, passage of time is difficult to be sure of in those circumstances, but that would be my best estimate.
You've said that other officers had good control. What were the other officers doing?
Again, my focus wasn't entirely on them, but I believe those officers kneeling down close to him, basically holding him in that position. I don't know whether that was against resistance or otherwise, or it was just keeping him from moving, as you would do with someone you were restraining on the ground.
Still putting weight on him?
No, I don't think so, no.
So you were able to see that?
I don't recall anybody putting weight on him at that point.
You don't recall what they were doing, or you don't recall them putting weight on him?
I don't recall them putting weight on him, and I'm not entirely sure exactly what they were doing. I know they were kneeling down with their hands on him.
Had they moved at all? You've told us you stood up. Had they moved?
I don't think so.
Right. Can I ask you to look at your inquiry statement, please? It's just immediately above paragraph 43. So it's actually paragraph 42, but that spans 3 pages. So it's immediately above paragraph 43. Thank you. And you say, I then began to consider the subject, and he was considering the issue of excited delirium. Thus far, he had shown considerable strength, and that irritant spray was not effective, although up to this point, he has shown no signs of ill health. I was still unaware of any earlier behaviour. As stated above, the training at this time was fairly limited, and I had never been exposed to excited delirium operationally, and as such I did not immediately come to any conclusion. This thought process still only lasted a few seconds and prompted me to have a closer examination of the subject. At this point, he appeared to me to be unconscious. An ambulance was contacted immediately. So it was at this point, where he's been turned to his left-hand side, that you appreciate then that he's become unconscious. Is that correct?
Yes, when I go to check on him.
Yeah. So when you've checked on him, he's unconscious.
Yes.
And at the moment that he was unconscious, so this is just after, is this just after he's been moved onto his left-hand side, you check and he's unconscious at that point?
Quite shortly afterwards, yeah.
When you say quite shortly afterwards, what do you mean?
As we said there, we asked how long was I, just attention slightly elsewhere. Round about that, within a minute of me standing up, him being turned aside around about that time, and me going back to look at him. So
you moved away and then went back to look at him?
Yeah, that's my recollection. I stood up, checked my hands, started to try and figure out what was going on, basically. Started to concern about the excited delirium thing, and then had a close look at him.
Right. Did you move back down towards him on the ground?
To have a close look at him?
From your standing position?
Yes.
So you stood up, checked your hands, and moved back down to the ground?
Yeah, I'm not sure quite how quickly that was.
Right. But you didn't move away from the area or anything of that sort?
No, still very much in the vicinity of him and the other officers.
Right. What were the other officers doing when you noticed that he had become unconscious?
I'm not entirely sure. I think they were still kneeling down beside him.
Did it appear to you they'd moved at all?
I don't think so, but I couldn't say with any certainty.
Okay. Can we look at paragraph 43 now, please? It says he was lying on his left-hand side with his handcuffed hands to the front. Other officers had hands on him. I'm not sure of the level of force being used, but I do not recall having any concerns about it. I do not think I was in physical contact with him, but was very close. Once I established he was breathing, I closely monitored him. I was not restraining him at this time. At this point, PC Tomlinson made me aware he had struck the subject to the head with a baton. I checked his head for signs of any serious injury, but could not find any. I'd like to ask you some questions about this. When you say you checked his head for signs of any serious injury, how did you do that?
Visually having a look and just running my hands over his head.
So you've told us that you had been standing, you'd
Yeah.
been at his feet area.
Yeah.
Where did you move to in order to allow you to check his head?
Directly in front of him.
To his front?
To his front, so the way he was facing, and close to his head.
So we've heard he's on his left-hand side.
Yes.
And his head's nearer to the hedge
Yes.
on Hayfield Road that you pointed out
Yeah.
earlier. So you went to his head, round the officers or round the front?
I can't remember.
And you've said, once I established he was breathing, I closely monitored him. What does that mean?
Just kept an eye on him, just watched him,
What were you looking for?
changing his pattern of breathing.
So you could see his breathing. Could you
Yeah.
see his chest moving?
Yes.
Could you see his breath, his mouth open or closed?
I can't remember if his mouth was open or not.
And was there at that stage or at any stage a nominated safety officer to monitor breathing?
I wouldn't say nominated, but
Or
I'd taken on that
appointed.
role. I mean, I think it would be clear that I was doing that to any person that was there. So I wouldn't say nominated as such, but
You had adopted that
Yes.
role. Would you explain what that role is?
I'm not familiar with that phrase, to be honest. I would suggest it's somebody whose sole role is to not monitor somebody's breathing.
But whatever the title,
Yeah.
you were the person there monitoring breathing.
Yes.
Thank you. And then paragraph 44, if we can have that on the screen, of your inquiry statement. A few minutes later, it appeared to me he had stopped breathing. I had been continually monitoring during this period and nothing else of note had happened. He was still in the same position on his side, and while I was watching it, appeared his chest had stopped moving, prompting me to voice my concern and look closer. You say a few minutes later you notice this.
Yes.
Can you give us an indication of the duration of that period?
Maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
And you said you looked closer. Describe what you did.
Sorry.
That's the last sort of line of paragraph 44. Prompting me to voice my concern and look closer.
So that would have been, what I did do was say, I don't know if I said he stopped breathing or is he breathing, but I said something along those lines, and I've turned him onto his back and carried out a thorough check to confirm whether he's breathing or not.
So how long was it that he was on his side before you turned him on his back?
Maybe 5 minutes. Again, it's difficult to gauge time, but that would be my best guess.
Okay. And then in paragraph 45, which we'll have on the screen just in the next page, you talk about other officers kneeling and standing close to Mr. Bio and not recalling any real level of restraint. But again, there may have been hands on him. There was no physical force being used. I was closely monitoring him. There was no real requirement for any direct assistance in this. What do you mean by direct assistance?
As in, I think that's possibly a response to how the question's been phrased that I've answered, whether anybody was helping me or not, but I was satisfied I was doing it myself and there was
Right.
nobody else required.
You were comfortable doing it
Yeah.
yourself without any other officer helping?
Yeah.
Right. And this said, my main focus was Mr. Bio and I was not really aware of what the other officers were doing. Other officers remained around at that time, as you've told us. So as I became concerned that breathing had stopped and was going forward to check, I heard another officer, I believe it was DS Davidson, also voice a concern that he had stopped breathing, and as such I assumed she was observing him closely in a similar manner to myself. So I'm quite interested, you see this sentence, as I became concerned that breathing had stopped and was going forward to check, was that going forward to check?
Yes.
Right. I heard another officer, I believe it was DS Davidson, also voice a concern that he'd stopped breathing.
Yes.
We've heard about DS Davidson. So she had also arrived on the scene at
Yeah.
some point, and that's when you heard her also voicing a concern.
Yes.
And you say you're assuming she was observing Mr. Bio closely in a similar manner to yourself.
Yes.
Was she near to you at that point?
I'm not really aware. She might have been back over my shoulder or something like that. She sounded close to me.
Leaving your inquiry statement for a moment, I'd like to go back to your PERC statement, 278, page 9 this time. And I'm interested in paragraphs 7 to 9. And that will begin, when I went down to the male I saw, there we are. When I went down to the male, I saw that his eyes were closed. I've initially tried to get a response to verbal stimulus, saying, "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" I think PC Peyton also tried to speak to him. That produced no response. I then tried physical stimulus, putting my knuckles in the bone in the top of his chest to see if I got a response, but I didn't get a response. At that point, the male appeared to be unconscious. I checked his breathing by putting my face towards his mouth and heard and felt breath and could see his chest move consistent with normal breathing. So at this stage, you have gone down, you see his eyes are closed, you've tried to speak to him, and you realise that he's breathing at that point.
And unconscious, yeah. Well,
but
yeah.
unconscious.
Yeah.
This is the point you realise he's unconscious.
Yes.
And his eyes are closed, but he's breathing.
Yes.
So this is the initial moment where you realise he's unconscious.
Yes.
Can I ask you about PC Peyton also tried to speak to him? Did anyone try and slap his face?
Not that I recall.
No. Do you recall PC Peyton doing anything like that?
No.
Did you try and slap his face at all?
Not that I recall. I don't,
Would you have done that?
no, I wouldn't.
You talk about physical stimulus, putting your knuckles in the bone in the top of his chest. Is that what you attempted to do to
Yes.
see if you could get a reaction?
Yes.
And did you get a reaction?
No.
No. Was there any sort of reaction or movement or sound?
No, I don't, no.
So you realised he was unconscious but breathing, and you've said he's breathing, and PC Peyton concurred. And you then say, I immediately passed a radio message stating that the male is controlled, highlighting the fact that the male appeared to be unconscious but breathing, and an ambulance was requested. So as soon as you realise he's unconscious, you call for an ambulance to be requested.
Yes.
And was that through an airwaves transmission?
Yes.
And would you look at the airwaves message 72517? And that's on page 7. 72517. And there's an airwaves transmission halfway down page 7 of the spreadsheet saying, PC Alan Smith, Roger, this male now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. And do you see that?
Yes.
That's the message that you
Yes, it
just
is.
referred to. And then can we look at PERC 278, please, again, page 10 this time. Paragraph 2. I was fully concentrated on the male at this point. I continued to observe him for about 3 minutes, at which point I became concerned that he wasn't breathing normally and his chest was not moving. So you've noticed he's unconscious, you've made your airwaves transmission, and then you concentrate on the male at that point.
Yeah.
You continued to observe him for about 3 minutes, concerned he wasn't breathing normally and his chest was not moving. How long did it take you to notice that his chest was not moving?
From what point where I became concerned?
After you made the call, the airwaves transmission?
About 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. I remember asking someone, I do not recall who, to take control of the male's head so I could go down and listen for breathing again. What do you mean, take control of the male's head?
Just hold it in position.
Right. I went down to listen for, do you know who that was that took hold of his head?
No.
I went down to listen for breathing again and there was nothing obvious. Due to my concern, I moved the male onto his back so I could check more thoroughly. So until you've noticed he's not breathing, he has remained on his left-hand side?
Yes.
It was only after you noticed he wasn't breathing
Yeah.
that you move him onto his back.
Yeah.
Due to my concern, I moved the male onto his back so I could check more thoroughly. I put my ear over his mouth, looking down the line of his chest, and within a few seconds determined that I couldn't feel, hear or see breathing. Is that the sort of technique that you used to determine whether he was breathing?
Yes.
And is that something you've learned in first aid training?
Yes.
Okay. I immediately said we need to start CPR, and PC Walker immediately started carrying out chest compressions. And so PC Walker was the first officer to start the chest compressions.
Yes.
How long after you noticed that he wasn't breathing and you turned him on his back and did PC Walker start the chest compressions?
Inside 10 seconds.
Is there a reason that when he was unconscious you hadn't turned him onto his back?
I was concerned about head injury. Well,
Sorry, I didn't hear you
there's
there.
2 points. That's the correct position for somebody to be in. If they're unconscious, is on their side, they would normally be in the recovery position, which is very close to that. But that's the position you would have an unconscious casualty. You wouldn't leave them lying on their back. Mm-hmm. Further to that, I was concerned the potential for a head injury as well, so I really wasn't wanting to move him unless I absolutely had to.
What sort of head injury were you concerned about?
I don't know. I'm not an expert, but he's been struck over the head with a baton, so...
Oh, you were concerned because you'd heard from PC Tomlinson.
Yes.
Right, sorry, I thought you meant that an injury could have occurred.
No, I hadn't
then.
established one, but that doesn't mean there's not
that
one.
was my mistake, right. So you knew by that point about PC Tomlinson having struck him on
Yeah,
the
he
head.
told me.
Yeah. So I'd like to just look at that timing, please. You've talked about him being on the ground, being turned onto his left-hand side. You notice then that he's unconscious. And can you remind me how long between you noticing he's unconscious and you making that airwaves transmission that he was unconscious and calling for an ambulance?
I think that would be fairly quickly after I realised he was unconscious.
Can you give us an indication?
A few seconds.
A few seconds. And so that airwave is at 7:25:17. And you call the ambulance, and then when you've noticed he's not breathing and CPR commencing, would you look at 7:29:30? Now this is on page 11 of the spreadsheet, and it's towards the top. And there's an airways, so it's the top of page 11 of the spreadsheet. You see 7:29:30, Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell makes an airwaves transmission. Control, can you get a move on with the ambulance? This accused is now not breathing. CPR is commencing. Over. How long after CPR commenced, with PC Walker starting the CPR, did Scott Maxwell make that transmission? Do you know?
I can't even remember him making it.
You
I'm
don't?
vaguely aware that he's made one, but
That's not something you can
No.
remember. But by the time Sergeant Maxwell makes the transmission, the male on the ground, Mr. Bio, is not breathing.
yeah, you would have to assume so if he's past that
Yeah.
at that point.
So somehow the information, the awareness you have that he's no longer breathing and CPR needs to start, that information has been transmitted somehow to Sergeant Maxwell, and he's made that airwaves transmission.
Yeah.
So that would be the chain of
Yes, I think so,
that.
yeah.
So from the moment he's unconscious but breathing, which is 7:25:17, there's an airwave, unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance,
Yes.
to Sergeant Maxwell and his airwave transmission, 7:29:30, that he's now not breathing and CPR is commencing. So that's a period of around, over 4 minutes. I'd like to know what's happening during that 4-minute period. So he's unconscious but breathing. You've told us you're monitoring, but for that 4 minutes, what's happening?
I'm keeping an eye on him and watching his breathing. And as I said, that's my sole focus. So other than that, I don't know.
What's everyone else doing?
I don't know.
Right, okay. We've heard that day that it had been raining. It's the 3rd of May. He's in a T-shirt. He's been restrained. He's had a Pava spray and CS spray and a head strike with a baton into his body. Was there any attempt during that period to perform any first aid or to make him more comfortable?
No.
Was there any attempt during that period to remove his handcuffs?
No.
Was there any attempt to remove his leg restraints after he was unconscious?
No.
Before he stops breathing?
No.
Why would these leg restraints not be removed at that point?
Because somebody is unconscious or apparently unconscious does not necessarily diminish the risk they pose. So people can make a sudden recovery and continue with the behaviour they've had before.
Right.
People, and I don't know reflection on Mr. Bayou, people can feign unconsciousness, which absolutely happens, and can attack police officers when their guard is down. So it's required to keep that level of restraint. If it is somebody suffering from ABD or some other medical issue,
Well, we've heard that's called acute
acute
behavioural
yeah, or excited
disorder.
delirium. Sorry.
Or excited delirium. And these are conditions that
yeah.
you've been trained on. I mean, I
Yeah.
think there may have been education may have improved since 2015
Yeah.
about these conditions. We'll no doubt hear more information in the future. But you're thinking about ABD. at that
Excited delirium at that
Excited
time.
delirium.
Sorry. If they are suffering from that, and you have the situation where they recover and the behaviour returns, the aggressive, violent behaviour returns, you've done that person no favours by removing the restraint, because all that's going to happen is they're going to have to be re-secured, re-restrained, and subject to another use of force. Presence of the restraints were not having any detrimental effects to his health, so they remained on.
As far as you were concerned, they weren't having any detrimental
Not
effect.
that I could see, no.
And then there was another call for an ambulance at 7:26:41 by Sergeant Maxwell. So that's shortly after. 7:26:41. And I think by this time, Sergeant Maxwell saying, "I'm just looking to clarify, has an ambulance been contacted for this accused?" And then ACR confirmed they'd asked for 2 ambulances. So by this time, I think a number of calls had been made about Nicole Short and getting an ambulance for her. So this was the second call to get an ambulance for Mr. Bayou.
Yes, it appears that way.
And was there anything going through your head at that time, during that 4-minute period, about the impact of the CS spray or the Pava spray or the head strike with the baton?
That could affect anything I could do.
That could affect anything you could have done at the time?
There's nothing. I'm not a paramedic. My first aid qualification is first aid at work. Same as somebody working in office who has a first aid qualification to deal with their workplace. The only thing we could do is what we were doing, keeping him in recovery position, closely monitoring him. There was no sort of intervention we could do to deal with any medical issues he may have, and there were no obvious ones, not obvious injuries or anything apparent.
Right. And then after he became unconscious and stopped breathing, you moved him onto his back at
Yes.
that point. Can I ask you about paragraph 48 of your inquiry statement, please? And then there's mention in this paragraph 48, difficulties administering breaths, and I'd like a little bit more information. 48, please, that's it. Difficulties in administering breaths to Mr. Bayou. I think that should be Mr. It was initially very difficult to fit the valve into his mouth. and once this was done, the breaths did not appear to be going in. PC Walker carried out further chest compressions while I tried to ensure the airway was not obstructed and refitted the mask. I tried further breaths, but these too seemed not to be working. Air seemed to be escaping around the side of the mask and the chest was not rising. I made several other similar attempts with the same result. It seemed to me that the breaths were not being effective and were preventing chest compressions from being carried out. As such, I made the decision that we would continue to carry out chest compressions only. So we could go back to the beginning of paragraph 48. Can you explain to us, you talk about a valve and a mask, and explain what was happening at this point?
So what we were trying to fit was a face shield that can be used to safely administer breaths during CPR. That's a piece of thick see-through plastic around the size of a handkerchief with a non-return valve in the centre of it. Can be placed in the mouth of the subject, and it allows you to safely deliver breaths into them through the non-return valve, reducing the risk of contamination for yourself for anything coming back out of their mouth into yours.
So it allows you to assist the person but protect yourself at the same time?
Yes.
And is that, we've heard from other officers that they had a pouch that attached to their utility belt with a safety first aid kit.
Yes.
Was that contained in that?
Yes.
Right. Is that something that all officers have?
They certainly all issued it.
Sorry?
They were all issued one, yes.
They're all issued?
Yeah.
And is that, you used yours that day?
I think so.
Yeah. And, but you seem to be having difficulty trying to apply administering the breaths.
Yes. Initially fitting the valve and then administering breaths once we've successfully done that.
What caused the difficulty for you trying to do that?
Initially, trying to get into his mouth was clenched shut or tightly shut, to the point where I had to put my fingers into the mouth and open it up. And thereafter, the difficulty, I could feel the valves working correctly, because there's air escaping out the sides, but it didn't seem to be going into his body. You would expect to feel almost, you can feel the air going out and expanding the chest, and that didn't seem to be happening.
So normally if the valve's working, do you feel the chest rising as the lungs
Yeah,
expand?
you're aware of the chest rising. You'll be looking down the line of the chest and you'll be able to see the chest.
So what position are you in
Kneeling down.
when you were trying to
Kneeling down beside his head.
Right. So you're not lying over him at that stage? You're
Leaning over him. But
kneeling over him?
Yeah.
How were you kneeling over him in relation to, were you at the side or were you...
At the side of his head.
At the side of his head?
Side of his head and shoulders.
So he's on his back by this stage. And is PC Walker applying CPR?
Yes.
And you're at the side of his head?
Yeah, on his right-hand side.
You were on his right-hand side?
Yes.
Using the valve?
Yes.
And the mask?
Yes.
And you could, when you felt his jaw clenched, or his jaw clenched shut, was that of any significance to you in terms of your first aid training?
It didn't mean anything to me, no.
But you were able to open his mouth manually?
Yes.
But the breaths that you were administering through the valve were escaping?
Yes.
And you didn't notice them going through the chest? Would you have been able to tell if they were going into the chest with PC Walker doing CPR?
He's not doing compressions at the exact moment I'm trying to administer breaths. So one person the compressions are administered once you've done the 30 of them, then you try to deliver 2 breaths and then you do the compressions again.
So the timing is synchronised with your companion PC Walker in the sense that you're working together to process that. Thank you. Now I understand that we've looked at the airwaves where Maxwell called an ambulance, and then can we look at paragraph 54? And I think at that point you're being asked about the ambulance. You say you didn't see them arrive. They initially started some form of more advanced care for the subject. Are you talking about the ambulance crew at that
Yes.
point? So when they arrived, did they take over?
Yes, I got stepped away at the exact moment they arrived, but
Right. I think we see on the spreadsheet reference to when the ambulance arrived, and that's on page 13 of the spreadsheet. I won't take you to the footage at this stage, but you'll see at 7:33 and 35 seconds that an ambulance arrives on Hayfield Road, approaching the roundabout and stops next to the large marked police van
yeah.
and near the group of people on the pavement area at Hayfield Road. And the officers were the group of people at Hayfield Road.
Yes, I think I was probably slightly away from them at that point.
So you'd maybe moved slightly away. Where
Yes.
had you moved to?
I'd become contaminated with bodily fluids in my mouth.
This is through using
Through
the valve.
while trying to use the valve and it failing, and material out of his mouth and nose, etc., ending up on the wrong side and in my mouth and what have you. So once we moved to compressions only, there's enough people there to carry that out who know what they're doing, so I stepped away to address that.
When you talk about material
Yeah.
and contamination, can you describe that material?
Saliva, mucus, out the nose.
What colour? What was it?
I've no idea, it was in my mouth.
All right, okay. When you became contaminated in that
Yeah.
way, what steps did you take?
I had a little tub of liquid hand. I stepped away, ensured the CPR was continuing. I had alcohol hand sanitizer, so I washed my mouth out with that and spat it on the ground, which seemed a reasonably sensible thing to do. I've then gone to a member of the public who was in his garden, asked for a glass of water, and rinsed my mouth out and spat that on the ground.
Can I ask you to look at some footage, and we'll just pause it. And I'm going to ask you to look at somebody through Venetian blinds in the Snapchat footage. So that would be around 7:21:21, I think. And we should see the Snapchat footage come up.
What's the locus? They just got blue lights stopped taking the galaxy to approaching. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong point. It's 7:22, sorry. 7:22:10. So you should see the Snapchat footage coming up shortly. And allow that to keep playing, please. And then at some point, I think you will see it pans round. And can we pause it there? Do you see in the right-hand pane through the Venetian blinds?
Yes.
There's somebody standing beside the hedge with a grey T-shirt on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that the person that you dealt with?
I can't recognise him. It would be roughly the right position.
Right. So it was somebody from the houses on that side of
Yeah.
Hayfield Road. Thank you. That's lovely. How long did the ambulance crew spend with the man on the ground?
It'd be a general estimate, maybe another 5 minutes.
And then what did you do when they left?
I went with them.
Why?
I was driving the ambulance.
And why did you drive the ambulance?
They asked me to. The impression I got was they were both wanting to go into the rear of the ambulance to continue the care for the subject.
So they continued to work on the man themselves in the rear of the ambulance,
Yeah,
and
that
you
would-
drove to the hospital?
Yes.
And we've heard that was Victoria Hospital, and that's quite nearby.
Yes.
How long did it take you to get there?
Probably 3 or 4 minutes.
And did you go straight to A&E?
Yes.
And then once you had arrived at the hospital, you mentioned earlier that you'd removed handcuffs.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you did when you arrived?
My memory's quite vague. We went quite quickly into the A&E department.
Were you with another officer, or were you just on your own?
DC Connell was in the back. I think it was DC Connell. Yeah, was in the back of the ambulance crew. There was a request to take the handcuffs off around about that point.
Who made that
I
request?
think, I don't know. It was either the ambulance crew or a doctor.
Right. And did you remove the handcuffs
I
yourself?
did, yes.
And that's when you noticed they were double locked?
Yes.
So you removed those. What about the leg straps?
The same, there was a request for one of the medical personnel to remove them, so I removed them.
A different person or the same
Oh,
person?
I don't know.
Can't remember. So they hadn't been removed in the ambulance?
No.
You removed them when you were actually in the hospital?
Yeah, definitely removed the handcuffs, and I was there when the restraints were coming off, but I can't even remember if that was definitely me or not.
Yeah. Prior to leaving Hayfield Road, had anybody spoken to you and said, given you any advice about maybe not speaking to anyone about the incident or anything along
No.
those lines? No. And can I ask you about when you went back to Kirkcaldy Police Office? What time did you get back there?
I have no idea.
No idea. Did you go straight from Victoria Hospital to Kirkcaldy?
Yes,
Police
I was
Office?
maybe at the hospital for half an hour and then directly back to Kirkcaldy Police Station, but
And I think you say in your statement 61, 62, 63, that's the numbers of the questions you've been asked by the inquiry team. I went straight to the canteen and sat at a table. The other non-CID officers who'd been at the locus were there. I think it's D.I. Robson was either there or came in a very short time later.
yes,
So you go straight to the canteen.
yes.
Thank you. And you say at paragraph 80 of your statement, there were several senior officers through the canteen area during the day. You see that?
Yes.
The only specific instruction I can recall was from D.I. Robson shortly after my arrival that the matter was not to be discussed. Do you remember when D.I. Robson gave you that specific instruction?
I think it was quite shortly after I arrived. I think that was when he spoke to us. My recollection back in the canteen isn't great.
Was the
but-
instruction given in the canteen by D.I. Robson, do you think?
Yeah, that's my recollection.
And why was your recollection not great when you got back?
Just because I was completely stunned, exhausted, mentally exhausted, in a state of shock.
And then you say you recall similar instructions from other senior officers whose identities I am no longer sure of, and from Amanda Given.
Yes.
Do you remember how many other senior officers gave you those similar
I
instructions?
don't know. There was, during the course of the day, there was various senior officers came and went. They were all giving roughly the same sort of talk, but was without being very specific on anything at all. I think there was another time somebody said not to discuss anything, but I don't know who I could attribute what statement to. It was all very similar and it all sort of blurred into one, and nothing they said was particularly memorable, in all honesty.
Okay. And did you comply with that instruction not to talk with anyone about the incident?
Yes.
And we've heard mention of, and I'll just give you these names and see if you recognise them: Conrad Trickett, Pat Campbell, and Stephen Kay.
I've no idea who Pat Campbell is.
Okay.
Conrad Trickett was the PIM manager.
Post-incident
Manager,
manager. And Stephen Kay
was the duty inspector
for the
area.
area.
Yeah.
Right. And then you mention Amanda Given. We've heard she was a Scottish Police Federation representative.
Yes.
Do you remember any advice or instruction she gave you?
No. She provided me with, as all officers, contact details for the SPF's legal advice line, or
Right.
something similar to that.
Yeah.
But I can't recall any specific advice she gave.
And did anyone give you advice in relation to your status? And when I say that, I mean as a witness or as a suspect.
No, I think, as I said, one of the senior officers coming in trying to offer reassurance, I think said something about not being suspects, but there was never any clear communication as to what your status was or what that meant.
And in terms of what you would have expected or what you would have wanted in terms of clear instruction, what would you have been looking for?
Clear guidance as to exactly what the process was, exactly what our status was, exactly what that meant. Although we're police officers, however, this is a very confusing situation in itself, and you're in a state of extreme shock and confusion and worry, and some of the officers were clearly deeply traumatized. So a clear explanation of exactly what your status is, exactly what that means, exactly what you're obliged to do, exactly what you're not obliged to do. But there was nothing of that sort.
And would you have felt it better to have got that clear guidance verbally or orally or in writing?
Both would be handy.
Both. Yeah. And in terms of giving statements, operational statements, do you remember any of the senior officers giving you advice or guidance or instruction in relation to that?
I think something was said at one point about nobody would be looking for statements that day.
Do you remember who said that?
I think it was Chief Inspector Trickett.
Do you remember when?
No,
Okay. But you think he gave you some advice that day about
I think so.
statements? Right. What about the other senior officers? Do you remember any of them discussing statements?
no, I don't. But again, I don't have a complete recall of everything all of them said, so
All
I
right.
don't remember it.
Can I ask you about your equipment that you had that day? You mentioned this in paragraph 74 of your inquiry statement. And you say you remained wearing your uniform, and my vest and cover containing my other PPE was, I think, placed on the floor in the canteen. This remained the case for several hours until my equipment was recovered from me in a separate room, as per points 75 and 76. I brought items of PPE and a radio that I recovered from the hospital and the locus. I asked Chief Inspector Trickett and Inspector Coombe what I should do with them. I stated that I thought I should retain them until they were seized. However, I was instructed, and if we could move down please, to leave them on the table in the canteen for the officers who were issued them to recover. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you were doing with the equipment, please?
As in how it came to be in my possession.
Yes.
So there's handcuffs and the leg restraints, which were removed from Mr. Bayou by myself.
In the hospital?
In the hospital.
And
so I
you'd
had
kept
them.
those?
Yes. When I was at
But
Locus,
I think you said earlier they weren't actually your
I'm
equipment.
fairly sure they're not. The leg restraints definitely weren't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reasonably sure the handcuffs weren't.
Okay.
There were other equipment. I can't say for sure now what they were. I know it says a radio there. I think it was maybe a radio, maybe a spray. When at some point when we were either during the restraint or during the CPR, I've seen these items of equipment lying on the ground, and just instinctively you pick them up, you secure them. You can't have police's equipment.
So you mean on the ground at Hayfield Road?
Yes. I couldn't tell you exactly where they were. It would be somewhere near where Mr. Bayou was, because that's when I was down on my knees.
Okay.
So I've picked them up, put them in my pocket or whatever, and hung on to them.
Was that before you left the scene in the ambulance?
Yes.
You didn't take photographs of them or secure them in the area?
No, at the time, it wasn't clear that this was going to be an incident that would have that level of investigation. And it's just an intuitive thing to do when there's a police of police equipment and there's a situation ongoing, and you get and it's lying about. You get the opportunity to secure it, so you just secure it.
So did you pick those off the ground prior to leaving in the ambulance?
Yes.
Right. Prior to the ambulance arriving?
I would think yes, yeah.
And tell us what you had with you. Sorry, you went through a list, but can you...
In relation to the additional equipment I've ended
Yeah,
up with,
yeah.
it was definitely leg restraints and handcuffs, a radio, and possibly a Pava spray or a CS spray.
So the radio and the Pava spray were from Hayfield Road?
Yes.
And the handcuffs and the leg straps were from Victoria
Yes.
Hospital? And that was 4 items in addition to what you normally carry yourself?
Yeah, that's what I can definitely remember. There might have been one more, but I wouldn't be able to be specific about it.
Did you mention spray and a baton? Can you have a look at paragraph 75? I don't want to get this wrong. Several hours later, all of the items described in point 73, as well as my baton, CS spray, handcuffs and radio, were taken possession of. So those were actually your items.
Those ones are referred to
You
there,
still
yes.
had those
Yeah.
items. And that was in addition to the other items you've mentioned.
Yes.
Right. So were the items, we've heard that some items of equipment and clothing were on the floor in the canteen or leaning up against the wall
Yes.
in the canteen. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And we've also heard that certain people would come into the canteen who weren't part of the response team. Do you remember anybody coming in and out other than the senior officers?
PC Mark K for Glenrothes was there.
Right.
I've no idea why, or what he was doing there, if he'd been given some sort of role or what have you. PC Barrett was there as an SPF representative.
Right.
For a time, I don't think he was there all day. That's all I can recall.
Okay, thank you. And you mention in your statement that there was a distinction made between the way DS Davidson and DC Connell were treated or handled after the incident and the way other officers were. Do you want to give us a little bit more information about that?
All the uniformed officers present were taken back to the canteen, and
That includes yourself?
yes, all the officers from the response team were taken back to the canteen and at some point told they weren't allowed to leave, and subjected to eventually a medical examination and seizure of clothing, etc. The CID officers who, as far as I'm aware, had a very, very similar level of involvement in the incident, did not, and as far as I'm aware, went back to their own office and did whatever they did.
And who were those CID officers?
DS Davidson and DC Connell.
Right. So they were allowed to move more freely in Kirkcaldy Police Office?
As far as I was aware, yes.
Right. And was it explained to you why there was a distinction between the way they were treated and
No.
the way the uniformed officers were?
No.
You see, no. And can I ask you to look at the paragraphs 82 to 85? It's actually one section of
Yep.
your statement, 82, 83, 84, 85. So this is in response to some questions, primarily about paperwork, if I can put it that way. In normal circumstances, notebook entries should be made following any incident of note. This is standard procedure, although I am unsure of the exact regulation requiring this. It is part of the standard operating procedures relating to use of force that for each incident where force is used above compliant handcuffing or taking, I think, hold of a subject's arm, is that right?
Yeah, that'll be right.
One use of force form should be submitted per incident prior to terminating duty. When an officer discharges their PAVA or CS spray, a discharge form should be submitted prior to terminating duty. I believe this is a legal obligation. So you're talking there about a use of force form, one per incident?
Yeah, I think that's incorrect, and I've
Oh, right.
applied the standardary use of force form that's came into force subsequent to 2015. I think the requirement for that was lower at that time, actually.
Lower than one form per incident?
No, the level of force required.
Oh, I see. So, as your understanding, in May 2015, did one use of force form have to be completed per incident, or was it one use of force form per any officer who had used the force?
I can't recall now.
You can't recall now. And then you think that you've maybe confused how much force was required
Yeah.
before that form,
Yeah.
the requirement
So
to complete
the
that form
procedure
was
for it's
triggered.
changed in the interim, and
Right. So this may not be entirely correct
Yeah,
for May
that's-
2015.
yes,
And then in relation to discharge of PAVA or CS spray, you mention a form, discharge or use of your
Yes.
spray form should be submitted prior to terminating duty. And you thought at the time that was a legal obligation.
yeah,
And that's where you're discharging your
Yes.
spray. Right. And that's by the individual officer who has discharged
That's
their
correct.
spray. Thank you. And if we could, can I ask you about operational statements? You were told, I think, and you said a moment ago, no statements were being sought.
yes.
What was your understanding of the requirement in relation to producing operational statements?
It would be done. Normally, you'd be requested to provide a statement for something if an officer investigating something required it from you.
We've heard from another officer, or maybe two, that the forms that you've mentioned were only capable of being obtained through the computer system
Yes.
that's in place. Do you remember if that's correct in 2015?
I believe so, yes.
Right. So did you have any access to a computer
No,
in the canteen? No. Were you offered access to a computer
no.
that day? You say that normally you personally are proactive in preparing notes and completing paperwork, but you felt mentally stunned that day. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you were feeling when you were in the canteen?
Just absolutely exhausted, completely drained, mentally drained as far as making decisions. Just not capable of having a reasonable thought process. Just, I don't know how to describe it other than exhausted, sort of like in a fog mentally.
And after you left duty that day, did you return to work the next morning?
Next afternoon, I think.
Next afternoon. Was that your next shift?
Yes.
Did you at any stage complete your notebook in
No.
relation to this? And can you explain why?
Shortly thereafter, I was given legal advice to not do so.
Do you remember at all maybe noting the names of the paramedics in your notebook?
Yes, I did.
So you had limited information really
Yes.
in regard to the paramedics
Yes.
and who they were. Nothing about the incident,
No.
though. So in relation to the incident, you were given legal advice.
Yes.
And when did you receive that advice?
I can't remember. Shortly after the incident, within a day or so.
Was that through the route you mentioned a moment ago with Amanda Given and the advice through SPF?
Yes, it wasn't directly through that.
No.
Through their legal advice line. Another.
Another firm?
Yeah.
Right. And can I ask you about something you mentioned in your PERC statement 278, page 14, please? And it's the penultimate paragraph. Right near the bottom. I did provide an account of what happened to an investigator acting on behalf of Professor Watson. We know that Professor Watson is a solicitor. And that was provided the week following the incident, but I do not know the exact date. It was noted down from me. I have seen a copy of that electronically. I still have a copy of that account. I have been asked to provide a copy of that account, but wish to seek advice before providing that to PERC. So this is what you said in your PERC statement
Yes.
that you gave on the 11th of June 2015. Now, do you still have access to that account of what happened at Hayfield Road?
I don't think so. I've not
No.
looked for it in a very long time.
Would you be in a position to look for it and to provide it to the inquiry?
I would have to seek legal advice on that.
Okay. So you'd rather seek legal advice and
Yeah,
then...
it's something I've provided directly to my solicitor, so I would run that by them prior to.
So your solicitor may have access to that account?
They may do.
We've heard from another officer who had received similar advice to you at the time, but has provided a copy of the statement. So would you be willing to ask your solicitor for that advice and consider providing that statement to the inquiry?
Yeah, I'd certainly ask.
Thank you. That would be excellent. Can I ask you finally some questions about race, please?
Yes.
You've obviously had, you are an OST trainer. You've had a lot of training yourself, and you've been trained to become a trainer.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you received training in relation to race yourself?
Under the OST training or?
Yes.
No.
Not under OST training?
No.
What about, but you sounded like you were going to say you have had training.
Yes.
Just not, what training, how did you access that other training?
It's the first week of training at the Scottish Police College when you join the police service.
All right, so that's at Tully Allen?
Yes.
Right. Any other types of training in relation to equality and diversity that you've had?
Not that I can recall.
So the equality and diversity training was when you started at Tully Allen?
Yes.
None since then?
Not that I can recall.
And was that prior to 2015 or to date?
To date, I think.
To date. And, I mean, do you remember the training you received at Tully Allen?
Not every detail of it, I can remember receiving it.
Did you learn much about unconscious bias?
I don't think so.
Right. Do you know what unconscious bias is?
Vaguely.
Right. Do you want to tell us what you...
Having opinions about people that affect your treatment of them without making conscious decisions.
Right. So subconscious.
Yeah.
And were you ever able to identify any unconscious bias in your own perceptions or beliefs?
No.
And in terms of the training you received at Tully Allen, were you able to implement any learning points from that into your own everyday practice?
I think broadly, in respect to these things, you try and treat everybody fairly and not treat them differently in respect of any differences they might have from you or might have from other people. Absolutely, you implement that into daily practice, but I would like to think I was doing that prior to being trained in it at Tully Allen in any case.
Right. And were you aware in Kirkcaldy Police Office in 2015 of any examples of racial discrimination?
No.
Or any racist jokes or racist comments being made at that time?
No.
And did any of your colleagues exhibit that type of behaviour as far as you're aware?
No.
If you had seen or heard any behaviour along those lines, how would you have responded?
It would depend upon the behaviour, but it would certainly be addressed, be that having given somebody some advice or reporting it up the line management.
Right. So if there was any racist behaviour exhibited, there would be a range of options for you in terms of how you'd respond.
Yes.
And how, thinking back to 2015 now, how do you think senior officers would have responded if there'd been any racist comments or behaviour?
I don't think they would have tolerated it.
What do you think their reaction would have been?
Again, I would imagine it would be along the lines of what I said. It would depend upon the exact circumstances of it, but I feel sure they would have taken disciplinary action if it was required.
Were you aware at that time about any public concern about the use of force by police officers, particularly in relation to black men?
No.
No. Were you aware of any wider concerns, not just in Scotland or in Kirkcaldy, but down south or abroad?
Just through keeping up with the news, aware of issues from parts of England,
Right.
Primarily London, but that's the one that seemed to make it to the papers.
Yeah. So was that issue one of concern for officers in Kirkcaldy or in Police Scotland? More
No.
particularly, no. Were you aware at that time of any high-profile cases in the UK where a person had died as a result of restraint or a restraint in the prone position?
No.
No. Was there much information sharing, as far as you were aware, in 2015 between forces around the UK in relation to problems arising with restraints or use of force?
I really wouldn't know. If there was information sharing like that, it would be done by people who work separately from me. So
So as a trainer, you were a trainer at that time, that's not something you were conscious of or aware of?
no.
Okay. What was your understanding in 2015 or awareness of the black community in Kirkcaldy?
Very little contact with the black community in Kirkcaldy.
Had you, excuse me, sorry, had you been involved in any community relation work at all?
No, that wasn't part of my role.
Sorry. Did you have any concerns about policing of the black community in terms of the use of force?
No.
Did you have much experience of the black community either as witnesses, as suspects, or as victims of crime?
No, very little.
Very little. Were you aware of stereotypes about black people, specifically in the context of criminal justice, perhaps being perceived as more likely to resist, to be less compliant, to be more violent, or to have superhuman strength or size?
No.
No. Do you have any assumptions along these lines?
No.
We've heard a number of descriptions during the hearings here, one of which was that Mr. Byle was the size of a house. Is that the type of view that you held in 2015?
No.
Is it possible that any stereotypes or assumptions influenced your approach to the events in Hayfield Road
No.
in 2015? Had you been faced with a white man who was 5'10", I think it's the same as yourself, 12 stone 10 in weight, with the suggestion that he'd had a knife or had a knife, although that wasn't visible, and you were there with a number of officers with the equipment that you'd had, would you have treated that person differently to the way you treated the events in Hayfield Road that day?
No.
If he'd been white, would you have called for an ambulance sooner?
No.
Would you have done more for him if he'd been white after he became unconscious?
No.
If he'd been white, would you have been more likely to assume he was under the influence of drink or drugs, or had a mental health crisis, or that excited delirium was more of a factor?
It wouldn't have made any difference.
You seem quite definite in that.
Yeah.
Looking back now, do you think his race may have played any role in any of your actions?
No.
Or the actions of other officers?
No.
If you could just give me a moment, please. Subject to any further issues that you or the assessors may wish me to raise or explore further, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Graham. Constable Smith, there's one thing that I would like to clarify with you, please. After you realised that Mr. Byle was unconscious, did you start monitoring his breathing?
Yes.
And at that stage, he was on his side, is that
Yes.
right? Before that, while he was in a prone position, was anybody monitoring his breathing?
I don't know.
As a general proposition, in a restraint involving someone in the prone position, would you expect one of the officers to monitor the breathing of the subject?
If it's something where they're going to be in a prone position for a prolonged period of time, it would certainly be beneficial if you're in a position to do that.
Thank you. Now, are there any Rule 9 applications at this stage, apart from Mr. Jackson? No. Mr. Jackson, do you have an application?
I do not, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Constable Smith, for coming to give evidence at the inquiry. When the inquiry rises, you'll be free to go. Now, we'll rise there and sit again on Tuesday at 10 o'clock.